dismantling the myth of democratization, the Mimicry Abyssinian Empire's reality under the moniker of Ethiopian state. We examine how Abyssinian Empire settler colonialism shaped modern regional politics beneath the public illusion of democracy. This analysis breaks down the historic statecraft mimicry used to maintain imperial hegemony under the national identity of Ethiopia. This presentation explores institutional structures, imperial legacies, and statecraft mimicry that created the long-standing Ethiopian democratization myth. Designed for scholars, students of political history, and analysts of Horn of Africa political history, it exposes the structural mechanics of centralized rule versus decolonization and self-determination, a core principle of international law enshrined directly in the United Nations Charter. By examining policy patterns and historical continuity, you will gain a clear framework to evaluate modern diplomatic narratives and state legitimacy. Understanding Abyssinian Empire settler colonialism provides crucial context for analyzing current political instability across the region. Subscribe for weekly political history breakdowns and leave a comment sharing which historical analysis you want to see covered next. Romanticize the nomenclature narrative of Ethiopia. Mainstream historiography has long propagated a romanticized narrative of Ethiopia as an unbroken, indigenous African civilization uniquely resistant to European colonization and inherently inclined toward state sovereignty and civilization. We critically deconstruct this paradigm, arguing instead that the modern Ethiopian state is, in fact, a dependent predatory settler colonial enterprise of historically constituted as the Abyssinian Empire. The Abyssinian core engaged in historical appropriation of the name to camouflage imperial expansion, internal colonization, and the subjugation of diverse autochthonous nations incarcerated in one of the most backward settler colonial empire. The utilization of the nomenclature of ancient historical prestige of Ethiopia, historically a geographic descriptor applied broadly to the people with dark skin in Africa and in Asia. They strategically appropriated the overarching historical, geographical, and geopolitical name of Ethiopia to legitimize the violent subjugation of diverse autochthonous nations across the southern, eastern, and western lowlands. The appropriation of historical names to legitimize emergent geopolitical entities is a well-documented phenomenon in statecraft. In the Horn of Africa, one of the most significant shifts in identity involves the name Ethiopia. Derived from the ancient Greek Ethiopia, translated from mythical theological root called Cush. It was applied broadly to people of dark complexion across the ancient world, Africa and Asia, by Greeks, the only continents they knew, and the people they encountered. The term historically referred to the vast Cushitic civilizations south of Egypt, most notably the kingdom of Cush, Mereh, that was destroyed by the warlord of Aksum. The formation of the contemporary settler colonial Abyssinian Empire, known with stolen trade name, Ethiopian state, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is frequently misunderstood in mainstream historiography as a process of national unification or anti-colonial resistance. By critical examination of this state-building project reveals a classic trajectory of settler colonialism and imperial expansion, executed not by European military power as it has been in the most cases of settler colonies, but by Abyssinian core warlords' armed guardian, killer hordes of the empire. Since her invention, she turned to the prison house the downtrodden helpless masses, relentless wars, chronic malnutrition, fleeing fro wars, internal displacements, eviction, incarceration of currently estimated to 130 million people of about 90 ethno-national groups, according to UN data ruled by series of dictators, one deposing the other by gun and rule by gun. Furthermore, we posit that empires are structurally incapable of democratization from within without complete systemic dissolution. Thus, the contemporary political crises in the region are the predictable outcome of an unliquidated settler colonial state attempting to perpetuate its hegemony through modern bureaucratic authoritarianism rules. They have been collections of criminal from within and the offspring of the resides of the settler colonialist who fled out of the empire since the 1974 People's Revolution. They residues of the offspring of settlers who reproduced in diaspora and final, went back and joined the contemporary tyrannic regime who preaches, built status to the cruelest outlaw warlords of the 19th century. The problem of nomenclature and imperial masking. The intersection of nomenclature, historical memory, and state violence constitutes one of the most powerful mechanisms of legitimization in modern political history. For over a century, the polity centered in the Abyssinian highlands, historically comprising the settler Semitic Habeshas known as Tigray, Amhara mainly, and parts of Eritrea. The historical trajectory of the name Ethiopia reveals a complex narrative of linguistic, cultural, and political transference. Originally denoting the ancient Cushitic civilizations of the Nile Valley, the name was progressively co-opted by the Abyssinian chieftaindom, a state founded substantially upon the cultural, linguistic, and genetic footprint of South Arabian, Yemeni, settlers who crossed the Red Sea in antiquity. By the 19th century, this appropriation was totalized. The Abyssinian elite successfully conflated their Semitic Christian highland identity with the ancient biblical and classical prestige of Ethiopia, rendering invisible the foundational Cushitic identity from which the name was originally derived. Recognizing this history is crucial for deconstructing the ethnic and historiographical complexities of the Horn of Africa. Critical historical and sociological analysis reveals that the application of this name to the Abyssinian Empire functions as a strategic camouflage. The name was strategically appropriated by late 19th century by Abyssinian ruler advised by his European mentor, most notably by Tefri Mekonnen, to elevate a regional, nominal, Christian, Abyssinian expansionist project to the status of a sacred and civilization empire. The truth has been diametrically the opposite. They were all criminal, cruel warlords, slave raiders, slaveholders, and slave traders. Looters, thieves, cattle raider killer hordes who lived as an obligate parasite on local population. They are super allergic to work and think. The Abyssinian state is fundamentally a dependent, predatory settler colonial empire that expanded southward, eastward, and westward in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, subjugating millions of indigenous peoples of Cushitic, Nilotic, Omotic families, such as the Oromo, Sidama, Somali, Kaffa, Walida, and Afar, among others. No historical empire, particularly one founded on settler colonial subjugation, extractions of surplus via agrarian feudalism, and ethno-national hierarchy, has ever successfully democratized from within while maintaining its imperial integrity. Democratization is fundamentally antithetical to the structural DNA of a settler colonial empire, which relies on domination, dispossession, and assimilation. The Abyssinian Empire as a settler colonial project. Settler colonialism is typically associated with transatlantic European expansion, wherein external colonizers dispossess indigenous populations to establish permanent settlements and restructure sovereignty. However, internal or contiguous settler colonialism operates similarly. As political scientists and historians of the Horn of Africa have noted, the expansion of the Abyssinian Empire under Menelik II mirrored the continental expansion of the United States or Tsarist Russia. 1. Territorial conquest and dispossession. Between the 1855 reign of Tewodros and 1913 death of Menelik, the Abyssinian military apparatus, bolstered paradoxically by European weaponry acquired through the scramble for Africa, embarked on a violent campaign of conquest. Lands belonging to the southern nations and nationalities were systematically confiscated. Indigenous populations were reduced to serfdom, the Gabar system, enslaved, alongside the forced laborers of indigenous Oromo mixed and livestock farmers for the new overlords. Wherein land was distributed to northern soldier settlers' garrison, dogs of war market system, like Finfin, at the central Chalama Plateau at the heart of Oromia, the site of the annual meeting of the General Assembly, 𝐂𝐬𝐬-𝐂𝐬𝐬, of all 5 twin moates from all compass direction of the Oromia, and the celebration of 𝐸𝐬𝐻𝐻, Oromo calendar's new year for time immemorial at Hora Finfin, means the hot spring water. The beautiful self-explanatory Oromo name was replaced with childish name, Addis Ababa, in favor of his wife. It means new flower. Once he settled in Finfin, for the first time escorted by thousands of killer hordes, lived in house with windows built by Alfred Ilg, the first white settler in Entoto Finfin in 1878. Henceforth Finfin turned the epicenter of the eviction of the Oromos and billeting the stolen ancestral Oromo land to the Abyssinian settler. The exodus of Abyssinian from the north to Finifin and the south, and by the primes of elimination of the Oromos, began to take its hold without limit to the very date. Finfin, a vital geopolitical strategical site, turned the center of springboard and the center of power struggle and control to rule the empire to the very date. She turned the center of the brain and architects the acts of genocidal war crime of Menelik the genocider, the mutilator of arms, legs of men, and the breast of women of the Oromo people. Menelik II the pitch black, Leopold of Belgium Congo to the contemporary retro-fascist personal dictator, war criminal political power usurper. 2. Cultural and linguistic erasure. Just as transatlantic settler colonialism sought to eradicate indigenous cosmologies, the Abyssinian Imperial project enforced cultural hegemony. The imposition of the Amharic language, the promotion of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tetrahedron Church as the sole state religion, and the systematic suppression of indigenous administrative systems, such as the Oromo Gada system, constituted an epistemicide. The conquered populations were treated not as citizens of a shared polity, but as gabars, tribute payers subjects, or meeks, strangers inferiors. 3. The dependent nature of the empire. Despite projecting an image of fierce independence, largely anchored in the 1896 Battle of Adwa against Italian forces, the Abyssinian elite operated within a web of geopolitical dependencies. The survival of the empire often relied on alignment with external imperial powers, whether British, Italian, or, during the Cold War, American and Soviet blocs. Predatory internally, the state remained economically and technologically dependent on external patrons, extracting wealth from the colonized peripheries to sustain a parasitic feudal center. The myth of democratization within imperial frameworks. A persistent fallacy in contemporary political science is the expectation that multi-ethnic empires can undergo a gradual, internal transition to liberal democracy without addressing the foundational question of imperial architecture. 1. The incompatibility of empire and democracy. Democracy requires a foundational demos, a political community that recognizes its members as political equals. Empires, by definition, operate on a hierarchy of core and periphery, ruler and ruled, colonizer and colonized. To democratize an empire while keeping its subjugated nations intact within the same coercive structure is an ontological impossibility. When an empire attempts democratization, it typically results in the majoritarian tyranny of the core demographic group masquerading as national unity. Because the state's apparatus was forged through conquest, any majoritarian electoral system merely formalizes the hegemony of the historically dominant settler colonial core over the peripheries. 2. Historical precedents of imperial collapse. History demonstrates that empires do not democratize, they decolonize or they collapse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Union, and European overseas empires did not evolve into harmonious democracies. Their internal contradictions, rooted in national subjugation, led to their dissolution or radical restructuring. The persistent framing of the Abyssinian state as an ancient nation, or an unassailable union, ignores the reality that stability within the empire has historically been maintained through the barrel of a gun, mass incarceration, forced famine, and state-sanctioned terror. From the invasion, conquest colonial settler Nefinas, armed killer hordes of Menelik, to the centralized feudal autocracy of 𝐾𝐤-𝐬𝐿, to the military junta of the Derg, and subsequently through the ethnic federalism of the EPRDF, to the centralizing tendencies of contemporary administrations. The state has continuously cycled through authoritarian iterations, precisely because its foundational structure is imperial, not civic. The camouflage of Ethiopia as a hegemonic shield. The appropriation of the name, Ethiopia, serves a dual ideological function. External legitimization. It provides the state with immunity from standard anti-colonial critiques. By presenting itself as a fellow victim of European imperialism, despite its own active participation in the colonization of non-Abyssinian nations. The state shielded its internal settler colonial practices from international scrutiny. Internal subsumption. It delegitimizes the liberation struggles of colonized nations within its borders. When indigenous populations demand self-determination, they are framed by the state and its ideologues as destabilizers, terrorists, or threats to unity, echoing the rhetoric used by traditional European colonizers against native freedom fighters. This linguistic and historical camouflage effectively inverts reality. The colonizer poses as the native, and the indigenous native resisting subjugation is branded as a separatist. The polity colloquially and officially known as Ethiopia in modern discourse is in urgent need of fundamental deconstruction. By analyzing it through the rigorous lenses of settler colonial studies and critical imperial critique, it becomes evident that the state is not an ancient, democratizing civilization, but a dependent, predatory Abyssinian empire built on the subjugation of diverse nations. True peace, stability, and human dignity in the Horn of Africa cannot be achieved by attempting to force democratization upon an unyielding imperial structure. Just as overseas empires had to be dismantled to allow for genuine self-determination and sovereign nation-building, the internal empire masked by the name Ethiopia must confront its foundational settler colonial reality. Until the rights of all colonized nations and peoples to self-determination are fully realized, the state will remain trapped in an eternal cycle of imperial violence, disguised under the borrowed prestige of an ancient name. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my historical posts. History comes alive because you take this journey with me, read every story, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your curiosity inspires me to dig deeper into the past every single day.